Imagine a world where the simple act of relieving yourself was a public spectacle fraught with danger. Picture a time when the most natural bodily functions were a source of constant discomfort and even life-threatening peril. For women living in the year 1238, this was not a dystopian nightmare, it was daily reality. How did they manage their most intimate needs? What hidden terrors lurked in every shadow, every street corner, every moment of personal vulnerability? Number 8. Social stigma and the weight of ignorance. For a woman navigating the daily realities of 1238, the constant struggle with sanitation was compounded by an invisible, yet crushing, burden, the weight of social stigma and an overwhelming lack of knowledge. It was a silent oppression, shaping how women perceived their own bodies, how they managed their health, and how they interacted with a world that offered little understanding or support. Imagine the gnawing anxiety that accompanied a woman from the moment she awoke until she finally found a moment of uneasy rest. Every bodily function, every symptom, every natural process was viewed through a lens of suspicion, misunderstanding, or outright shame. It was a world where knowledge about the human body, especially the female form, was rudimentary at best, steeped in superstition and ancient beliefs rather than scientific understanding. Consider the pervasive theories that dominated medical thought, if one could even call it that, in the 13th century. The idea of the four humors, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, dictated all understanding of health and illness. Imbalance was the cause of disease, and treatments were often based on restoring this delicate equilibrium through methods like bloodletting or purging. For women, an additional layer of misconception was applied, often linking their very nature to inherent weakness or moral failing. Medieval texts, often written by men and steeped in religious doctrine, frequently depicted the female body as imperfect, prone to corruption, and inherently mysterious. This translated into a profound lack of accurate information about conditions specific to women, from menstrual cycles to childbirth complications. A woman suffering from constant bladder infections, a common woe given the unsanitary conditions, might not have her physical discomfort recognized as a medical issue at all. Instead, it might be attributed to a moral flaw, a punishment from God, or even the work of malevolent spirits. This pervasive ignorance meant that genuine physical ailments were often left untreated, simply endured, or addressed with ineffective, sometimes harmful folk remedies passed down through generations. The very act of menstruation, a natural and essential biological process, was cloaked in layers of taboo and fear. In many medieval societies, a menstruating woman was considered ritually unclean. She might be forbidden from entering certain religious spaces, touching particular foods, or even participating in specific household tasks. Imagine the constant vigilance required to hide any sign of her cycle, the desperate measures taken to conceal stains on her clothing, the pervasive worry that a telltale odor might betray her natural state. A woman on her period might be forced to withdraw from social life, her daily routine disrupted, simply because of a bodily function she could not control. This was not merely about discomfort, it was about social ostracization, a silent judgment that reinforced her perceived impurity. Historical accounts mention beliefs that a menstruating woman could sour wine, wither plants, or even cause animals to sicken. While not universally applied in every village, the underlying sentiment of impurity was widespread, forcing women into a life of secretive management and shame. Could a woman openly discuss her needs, her pains, her struggles with hygiene during these times, when merely acknowledging them could bring censure? Childbirth, while a celebrated event for its outcome, was also shrouded in a similar veil of secrecy and often dread. The process itself was primarily managed by women midwives and female kin, but the medical understanding of aseptic practices was non-existent. A woman giving birth in a damp, smoke-filled hovel, on a dirt floor or straw bedding, was already facing immense physical risk, but the social and religious narratives added another layer of fear. The pain of childbirth was often seen as divine punishment for Eve's original sin, a decree from God that women would bring forth children in sorrow. This belief, while perhaps offering a spiritual framework, did little to alleviate the physical suffering or to encourage practical, hygienic measures. Pain was ordained, perhaps attempts to mitigate it, or the unsanitary conditions that exacerbated it, were seen as going against divine will. A woman who died in childbirth, a tragically common occurrence, might be mourned, but her death was rarely attributed to preventable infections or unsanitary practices. It was often seen as fate, God's will, or a reflection of her own inherent fragility. Furthermore, the very act of seeking any kind of medical advice for women's problems was fraught with difficulty. Male physicians, if available at all and not just barber surgeons or apothecaries, often possessed scant knowledge of female anatomy and even less empathy for women's specific discomforts. Their understanding was often based on classical Greek texts that sometimes misidentified organs or perpetuated harmful theories. Women therefore often relied on the wisdom of older women in their community, wise women, or local healers who might use a mixture of herbal remedies, superstitious charms, and practical advice. While some of these practices offered genuine comfort or mild relief, they were rarely rooted in an understanding of microbial transmission or basic hygiene. The reliance on these informal networks, while a testament to female solidarity, also meant that accurate knowledge about preventing infections or managing chronic conditions was severely limited. There was no widespread concept of germs, no understanding that washing hands or sterilizing instruments could prevent death. The cause of a raging fever after childbirth, or a persistent cough, or a chronic skin ailment was a mystery, often attributed to bad air, an evil eye, or an imbalance of humors. The shame extended to everyday bodily functions. Imagine the constant fear of accidental urination, especially common among women after childbirth or as they aged, with no access to effective absorbents or discreet disposal. The lingering odor, the dampness, the impossibility of maintaining dignity in such a circumstance must have been a constant source of quiet humiliation. There were no incontinence pads, no deodorants, no readily available change of clothes. A woman experiencing such an issue would often have to endure it, silently, hoping that the pervasive smells of medieval life would mask her plight. This private suffering, hidden from public view but ever present in her own experience, chipped away at her sense of self-worth. Even the general dirtiness of daily life, inescapable as it was, carried a different resonance for women. While men might be seen as rugged and enduring in their filth, women were held to a higher standard of cleanliness, or at least a standard of appearing decent, despite the overwhelming odds. They were the ones tasked with maintaining the home, preparing food, and caring for children, all activities that demanded a certain degree of cleanliness, yet were performed in environments utterly lacking in hygienic infrastructure. A woman trying to keep her children clean in a home with a dirt floor, open sewage, and no running water was engaged in a Sisyphean task. The effort was immense, the results often minimal, and the societal expectation remained. This constant, unacknowledged labor, performed under the gaze of judgment, added to the psychological burden. The stories of women from this era, pieced together from scanty records and archaeological findings, whisper of lives lived under a persistent cloud of physical discomfort and social anxiety. They reveal an unspoken understanding that their bodies were sources of vulnerability and potential shame. This deep-seated ignorance and the resultant stigma created a cycle. Lack of knowledge led to poor hygiene, which led to illness, which was then attributed to moral failings or bad luck, thus reinforcing the lack of knowledge and preventing any real progress in understanding and addressing the root causes of their suffering. For a woman in 1238, the horrors of sanitation were not just about the physical filth. They were about the profound mental and emotional toll exacted by a society that offered little comfort, less understanding, and no escape from the relentless cycle of dirt and disease. Number 7. Contaminated food and drink. Imagine living in a world where every bite of food, every sip of water, held the hidden potential to become a deadly poison. For women in 1238, who were often the primary caregivers and food preparers for their families, this wasn't a distant threat. It was a daily, agonizing reality. The challenge of providing safe, nourishing sustenance for their loved ones was a monumental task, fraught with dangers that were largely invisible and utterly beyond their comprehension. This was a time before the germ theory of disease, before refrigeration, before stringent food safety regulations. What was on offer in the markets, or harvested from the fields, often arrived in a state that would horrify modern sensibilities, and the methods of its preservation and preparation offered little in the way of protection. Consider the journey of food from its source to the family table. Grains, the staple of the medieval diet, were often stored in damp, unventilated granaries, making them susceptible to mold, rodent infestation, and insect damage. Imagine a woman, perhaps a miller's wife, sifting through sacks of flour, trying to pick out the evidence of infestation, knowing that despite her efforts, some of the contamination would inevitably remain. Archaeological digs have unearthed evidence of ergot poisoning from contaminated rye, a terrifying affliction that caused convulsions, gangrene, and hallucinations, often mistaken for demonic possession. Constant struggle to identify and remove spoiled portions was a relentless chore, one that often failed, leading to chronic low-level illness or sudden, devastating outbreaks within a household. Meat, a rarer commodity for many, presented its own set of terrifying challenges. Without refrigeration, slaughtered animals had to be consumed quickly or preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. These methods, while effective to a degree, were not foolproof. Butchers often operated in unsanitary conditions, their stalls open to the elements, attracting flies and vermin. Imagine a woman haggling over a piece of meat, trying to discern its freshness by smell and touch, a skill honed through generations of grim experience. Even then, the invisible threats of bacteria like Salmonella or E. coli lay dormant, ready to unleash crippling dysentery or fatal fevers. Historical records occasionally mention widespread illnesses following feasts or communal meals, hinting at the tragic consequences of a single contaminated carcass. The responsibility of preparing this meat fell squarely on the woman's shoulders, from handling the raw portions to cooking them over an open fire, often with little understanding of the temperatures needed to truly neutralize pathogens. Vegetables and fruits, grown in fields fertilized with human and animal waste, were another vector for disease. While washing would remove some surface dirt, the microscopic parasites and bacteria lurking in the soil were impossible to see or fully eliminate without clean running water. Imagine a woman preparing a meal from fresh produce, rinsing turnips or scrubbing carrots in a communal trough or a bucket of water that had already been used for multiple purposes. The very act of bringing healthy, fresh ingredients into the home could, paradoxically, introduce illness. A woman, perhaps a young mother, might spend hours tending her small garden plot, pouring her labor into nurturing kale or beans, only for them to become the unwitting carriers of the very ailments that weakened her family. And then there was water. The lifeblood of any community, yet in 1238, often its greatest threat. Public wells, rivers, and streams served as communal sources for drinking, washing, and waste disposal. It was a common sight to see people drawing drinking water from the same river where human waste was dumped upstream, where animals drank, and where laundry was washed. Imagine the burden on a woman, likely a young girl or older daughter, who often had the arduous task of fetching water. She might spend hours walking to a distant well, carrying heavy buckets back to her home, only to know, deep down, that the water, while clear, was not truly clean. Accounts from medieval monasteries, which often had more advanced water systems, occasionally reveal efforts to separate water sources, but for the common villager, such foresight was rare. The water used for brewing ale or cider, often considered safer than raw water due to the fermentation process, still started from a potentially contaminated source, and the containers themselves were rarely sterilized. Constant threat of waterborne diseases like dysentery, cholera, or typhoid was ever present, silently stalking every household. Child's sudden, violent vomiting or diarrhea was often the first terrifying sign, and it was the woman who would be left to nurse them, desperately trying to keep them hydrated with more of the very water that might have caused their affliction. Food storage was a constant battle against spoilage and pests. Without modern containers, food was kept in earthenware pots, wooden barrels, or simply laid out on surfaces. Vermin like rats, mice, and cockroaches were ubiquitous, crawling over stored grains, gnawing at bread, and leaving their droppings, each a tiny package of potential illness. Imagine the endless task of trying to protect food from these invaders, knowing that despite your best efforts, they would always find a way in. A woman preparing a simple loaf of bread might find evidence of rodent activity in her flour, yet discarding it all was often not an option given the scarcity of resources. She would simply try to remove the most obvious signs and proceed, hoping for the best, a silent prayer on her lips. Even the process of cooking, meant to render food safe, was limited by the technology of the time. Open fires in hearths while providing heat were difficult to regulate, leading to uneven cooking. A woman might spend hours stirring a stew, trying to ensure that every morsel was thoroughly heated, but without thermometers or a concept of safe internal temperatures, some pathogens could survive. And the constant smoke from these fires, while a different kind of horror, also meant that fine ash and soot could settle onto food, further contaminating. The very hands that kneaded the dough, stirred the pot, or prepared the vegetables were often themselves carriers of bacteria, having just tended to animals, cleaned a chamber pot, or nursed a sick family member, with no access to effective soap and water for thorough washing. The knowledge of cross-contamination was centuries away. Daily struggle with contaminated food and drink was a relentless, invisible war fought by women on the front lines of their homes. Every meal prepared was a gamble, every drink a potential risk. Toll was immeasurable, manifesting in chronic illness, weakened immune systems, and sudden, devastating epidemics that swept through communities, disproportionately affecting the vulnerable, the young, the old, and those already weakened by malnutrition and constant exposure to filth. The woman, watching her child sicken from food she had carefully prepared, or enduring the gut-wrenching pain of dysentery herself, bore the silent burden of a problem she could not comprehend, let alone conquer. Number 6. Unsanitary living conditions in homes. Step inside a typical home in 1238 and prepare your senses for an assault of the unbearable. For women whose lives revolved predominantly around the domestic sphere, the very walls of their dwelling held a pervasive, inescapable horror, the constant, grinding reality of unsanitary living conditions. This wasn't merely about dirt. It was about a fundamental lack of infrastructure and knowledge that turned the humble dwelling into a breeding ground for disease, a constant source of discomfort, and a tireless battleground against filth. Imagine the sheer futility of trying to create a semblance of cleanliness in an environment designed, it seemed, to defy it. Most homes, whether in a bustling town or a secluded village, were rudimentary structures, often with dirt floors. Imagine the perpetual dampness that seeped up from the earth, especially after rain or snowmelt. This wasn't just messy, it created a perfect environment for molds, fungi, and parasites to thrive. A woman would spend her days sweeping, trying to gather the loose soil, the dried mud, the bits of straw and refuse that constantly accumulated, only for it to be tracked in again moments later by children, animals, or her husband. The act of sweeping dirt from a dirt floor was a paradox, a symbolic gesture rather than an effective cleaning method. When things were spilled, water, milk, bodily fluids from a sick child, they simply soaked into the earth, creating festering patches that would never truly dry or be sanitized. The air would be thick with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and decay, a constant, oppressive scent that clung to clothing and skin. Animal cohabitation was not merely common, it was often an economic necessity. Livestock, chickens, pigs, sometimes even cows, were often kept inside the home, especially during colder months, for warmth and protection against theft. Imagine sharing your living space, your kitchen, your sleeping area, with animals that defecated and urinated freely. Their waste, mixing with the damp earth, created a potent cocktail of ammonia, methane, and countless bacteria. Constant buzzing of flies, drawn by the filth, would be an omnipresent soundtrack. A woman preparing food would be swatting at flies, trying to prevent them from landing on the meager meal, knowing that the same flies had just landed on animal dung mere feet away. The risk of zoonotic diseases, illnesses passed from animals to humans, was immense, a silent, invisible threat lurking in every corner. Children playing on the dirt floor would be constantly exposed to animal excrement, leading to a high incidence of worms and gastrointestinal infections. Ventilation was practically non-existent. Homes were often single-room dwellings, designed to keep warmth in during the cold months, which meant small windows, if any, and doors that were kept shut. Primary source of heat, an open hearth, filled the dwelling with smoke. This smoke, while perhaps acting as a mild repellent for some insects, was a constant irritant to the lungs and eyes. Imagine a woman, her eyes perpetually watering from the acrid smoke, her lungs burning, spending her days tending the fire, cooking, and performing chores in an atmosphere thick with particulate matter. This chronic exposure contributed to respiratory illnesses, especially among women and children who spent the most time indoors. The air, heavy with smoke, animal odors, and the general effluvia of unwashed bodies and unemptied chamber pots, would be stifling, a constant affront to the senses. Thatch roofs, a common roofing material, while practical, also created their own problems. provided excellent shelter for vermin, rats, mice, and insects, who would nest in the straw, their droppings and nests falling into the living space below. Imagine the unsettling scratching sounds above your head at night, the sudden scurry across the floor, the constant battle against these unwelcome, disease-carrying tenants. A woman might wake to find rodent droppings on her sleeping mat, or discover a rat had chewed through a stored sack of grain. This wasn't merely an annoyance. These creatures were vectors for plague, typhus, and a host of other debilitating diseases. Daily effort to keep them at bay was a losing battle against nature's persistent reclaimers. Overcrowding was another silent horror. Large families often shared a single room, sometimes with several generations living under one roof. Imagine the lack of personal space, the constant proximity to sick family members, the rapid spread of contagious diseases within such confined quarters. When one person fell ill with a cough, a fever, or the dreaded dysentery, it was almost guaranteed to spread rapidly to everyone else. The woman, often the primary nurse for the sick, had no means of isolating herself or the ill person, no way to prevent the transmission of germs in such close quarters. The very warmth provided by body heat and the presence of animals, while a comfort in the harsh winters, also served to incubate and spread illnesses more efficiently. The lack of proper heating, beyond the central hearth, meant that many parts of the home remained damp and cold, leading to less air circulation and perpetuating the growth of mold and mildew. Food storage without refrigeration meant that food often spoiled quickly, adding its own stench of decay to the already pungent atmosphere. Waste disposal within the home was limited to chamber pots, which, once full, would sit in corners until emptied outside, often attracting more flies and adding to the offensive odor. Imagine the constant vigilance required to empty these, often multiple times a day, trying to minimize spillage and the inevitable stench. For a woman in 1238, her home was not a sanctuary from the world's filth, it was an extension of it. It was a place where she constantly battled against forces beyond her control: dampness, pests, animal waste, and the pervasive lack of clean water and proper waste disposal. The relentless effort required to maintain even a minimal level of order and a semblance of health within these unsanitary walls was an exhausting, thankless task. Persistent odors, the omnipresent flies, the unseen pathogens, and the constant awareness of sickness lurking in every shadow were a daily, silent torment, shaping her physical health and emotional resilience in profound and devastating ways. Number 5. Disease transmission from poor waste disposal. Consider for a moment the very ground you walked upon in 1238, the air you breathed, the surfaces you touched. For women whose lives were deeply intertwined with their immediate surroundings, the home, the market, the local well, the omnipresent horror of poor waste disposal was not an abstract concept. It was a tangible, putrid reality that bred disease and stalked every waking moment. This wasn't just about unpleasant smells. It was about a deeply flawed, almost non-existent system of waste management that turned every street, every alleyway, and even the immediate vicinity of homes into a veritable cesspool, fostering invisible killers that thrived in the filth. The streets of medieval towns and villages were, by modern standards, open sewer. Human and animal waste was routinely dumped directly into the thoroughfares, sometimes just outside the door of a house. Imagine a woman, her skirts held high, carefully navigating a path through ankle-deep muck that consisted of urine, feces, discarded food scraps, and animal manure. The very act of walking to the well or the market was an exercise in avoiding literal mountains of filth. Historical accounts from various European cities in the 13th century describe streets so clogged with refuse that they became virtually impassable after heavy rains, transforming into rivers of putrid sludge. This wasn't a temporary inconvenience, it was the norm, a constant, sickening tableau that served as a fertile breeding ground for countless pathogens. There was a profound lack of drainage systems. Rainwater, instead of being channeled away, would simply mix with the street waste, spreading the contamination further. Imagine a heavy downpour turning the street outside a woman's dwelling into a churning stream of diluted sewage, carrying all manner of pathogens directly to her doorstep, seeping into the ground, and potentially contaminating shallow wells. The stagnant puddles of wastewater, remaining for days after rain, became perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes and other disease-carrying insects. The stench, especially in warmer months, would have been overwhelming, a constant reminder of the unseen danger. It was a smell that permeated everything: clothing, hair, the very air breathed inside the home, carried in on the shoes of every passerby. Proximity of living quarters to this festering waste was a terrifying reality. Homes were often built directly adjacent to or even over waste pits. For those with a garderobe, a rudimentary privy that emptied directly into a cesspit or moat, the convenience came at a terrible cost. The smell, even if somewhat contained by the wall, was ever present, and the pit itself was a magnet for rats, flies, and other vectors. For the vast majority of people, waste from chamber pots was simply flung into the street or into a communal dung heap. Imagine a woman needing to empty her family's chamber pot, stepping out into the alley and adding its contents to the already overflowing pile, knowing that this was her only option and that the wind would carry the stench and the flies directly back into her home. Flies, rats, and other vermin were not just nuisances, they were deadly agents of disease transmission. Flies attracted to the fecal matter and rotting food would land on the waste, pick up pathogens on their tiny legs, and then fly into homes, landing on food, on faces, on sleeping children. Rats nesting in the overflowing refuse carried fleas that were vectors for devastating diseases like the bubonic plague. Imagine a woman constantly shooing away flies from her simmering pot, trying to protect her children from the rats that scurried across the floor, knowing that these creatures were a constant, relentless threat. Casual coexistence with these disease vectors was a hallmark of medieval life, and women, as the primary caretakers of the home and children, bore the brunt of the consequences. They were the ones who would first notice the signs of illness, the sudden fevers, the violent vomiting, the crippling diarrhea that signaled the arrival of a waterborne or vermin-borne plague. The spread of diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid was a common and terrifying occurrence. These waterborne and foodborne illnesses thrived in environments with poor sanitation. A single infected person, using an unsanitary latrine or simply defecating in the street, could contaminate the local water source, triggering a devastating outbreak that could decimate a village or a district within a town. Imagine a woman watching her entire family succumb to dysentery, their bodies racked with fever and dehydration, with nothing but herbal remedies and desperate prayers to offer. She would be the one changing soiled linens, trying to clean the sick, and risking her own life through constant exposure to the very pathogens that were ravaging her loved ones. The helplessness in the face of such relentless, seemingly inexplicable illnesses must have been utterly shattering. Even the process of burial contributed to the cycle of disease. Graveyards were often located within urban areas, and shallow graves, combined with high population density and the lack of proper containment, could lead to the contamination of groundwater. Imagine a woman drawing water from a well that was silently, invisibly being polluted by the decomposing bodies in a nearby, overcrowded burial ground. The very act of mourning the dead could, unknowingly, be a precursor to the sickness of the living. Constant, gnawing fear of invisible threats was a heavy burden, adding to the daily physical toil of medieval life. For women in 1238, the horror of poor waste disposal was a relentless, multi-sensory assault. It was the pervasive stench that clung to the air, the sight of human filth in every public space, the constant buzzing of flies, the scuttling of rats, and the terrifying, incomprehensible illnesses that swept through families with brutal efficiency. They lived in a world where the very act of existing meant a constant, unavoidable exposure to the unseen agents of death, a battle they fought every day without understanding the enemy. Number 4, limited access to clean water for personal hygiene. Imagine waking up to the pervasive, lingering smell of unwashed bodies, knowing that your own skin felt grimy, your hair matted. For women in 1238, the dream of a truly clean body was largely just that, a dream. Limited access to clean water for personal hygiene was a fundamental, agonizing horror that impacted every aspect of their daily lives, from their comfort to their health, and even their social standing. This wasn't merely an inconvenience. It was a constant, debilitating reality that fostered skin infections, perpetuated body odor, and created an environment ripe for disease, all while demanding immense effort for meager results. The process of obtaining water itself was an arduous chore, typically falling to women and children. Communal wells, rivers, and streams were the primary sources, often located a considerable distance from home. Imagine a woman, perhaps carrying a baby on her back, navigating uneven, muddy paths, carrying heavy wooden buckets or earthenware pitchers, making multiple trips a day just to gather enough water for cooking, drinking, and a meager attempt at washing. This monumental physical effort meant that water was a precious commodity, its use carefully rationed. Personal hygiene, therefore, was often sacrificed in favor of more immediate needs like cooking and watering livestock. Even when water was obtained, its cleanliness was highly suspect. Communal wells, though providing a central source, were often susceptible to contamination from nearby cesspits, animal waste, or general runoff. Rivers, while offering abundant water, were frequently used for dumping human waste upstream, for washing laundry downstream, and for animals to drink and bathe. Imagine drawing water from a river where, just 100 yards upstream, chamber pots had been emptied or raw sewage flowed from a town's primitive drains. The water might appear clear, but it was teeming with invisible bacteria, parasites, and viruses. Using such water for washing, even if it didn't directly cause a waterborne illness, could introduce pathogens to cuts, scrapes, or mucous membranes, leading to skin infections, eye infections, and other ailments. Bathing habits were a world away from modern routines. Full-body immersion was a rare luxury, largely confined to the very wealthy who could afford the fuel to heat large quantities of water and had private bathing facilities, or to communal bathhouses, which, while offering warmth, were not always centers of pristine hygiene themselves. For the common woman, bathing was an infrequent event, perhaps a few times a year, often in a communal setting or a large wooden tub in her home, shared with other family members. Imagine the process: heating precious water over an open fire, a laborious task, then using the same water once cooled to wash multiple people. The concept of fresh, clean water for each wash was unimaginable. More common was a dry bath, involving rubbing down with cloths, or simply washing hands and face with whatever small amount of water could be spared. This meant that dirt, sweat, and body odor accumulated day after day, week after week. The availability and quality of soap were also significant limitations. While some forms of soap existed, often made from animal fats and lye, they were rudimentary, harsh on the skin, and expensive. Most people simply used water, or abrasive materials like sand or ash, for washing. Imagine a woman trying to clean her hands after tending to animals or preparing food, knowing that the rough soap barely lathered and left her skin feeling stripped, yet still not truly clean. The lack of effective detergents meant that grime, dirt, and oil built up on the skin, creating an ideal environment for rashes, sores, and fungal infections. Scabies, lice, and fleas were common plagues, their constant itching a source of misery, exacerbated by the inability to thoroughly wash away eggs and parasites. Hair washing was an equally challenging endeavor. Long hair, common for women in medieval times, was prone to becoming greasy, matted, and infested with lice. Imagine the monumental task of trying to wash a woman's long hair with limited, often cold, water and harsh, ineffective cleansers. It was often a chore performed rarely, leading to constant discomfort and the pervasive issue of head lice. Itching and the social stigma of visible infestations were a constant, nagging irritation. Women often resorted to tightly braiding their hair or covering it with coifs or veils, not just for modesty, but perhaps also to contain the visible signs of unkemptness and infestation. The impact of this chronic lack of cleanliness extended beyond mere discomfort. Skin infections, festering sores, and boils were common, often becoming dangerous if left untreated, sometimes leading to sepsis. Constant irritation from dirt and parasites could lead to chronic scratching, breaking the skin and opening further pathways for infection. Pervasive body odor, a natural consequence of infrequent washing and heavy, layered clothing, created a silent social barrier, influencing interactions and reinforcing the sense of being perpetually unclean. For a woman who might be trying to maintain her appearance for a husband or for public dealings, this physical reality was a constant, frustrating struggle against overwhelming odds. 1238, personal hygiene was not a routine of refreshing cleanliness. It was a battle against constant grime, an exercise in resourcefulness with minimal tools, and a daily acknowledgement of pervasive physical discomfort. For women who were often the guardians of whatever small stores of water existed and the bearers of the burden of fetching it, the limited access to clean water for personal washing was a fundamental horror that shaped their health, their appearance, and their experience of simply existing in a world utterly devoid of what we now consider basic sanitation. Number 3, childbirth and postpartum sanitation. Imagine the most profound, vulnerable moment of a woman's life, bringing new life into the world, occurring in an environment where hygiene was not just absent, but utterly inconceivable. For women in 1238, childbirth and the postpartum period were not merely physically arduous. They were journeys through a landscape of unsanitary conditions, where every contraction, every push, every breath after the birth was fraught with the invisible, deadly horror of infection. This was a time when the celebration of new life often walked hand in hand with the silent, insidious threat of death, directly caused by a fundamental lack of understanding about cleanliness and contagion. The birthing environment itself was far from anything remotely sterile. Childbirth typically took place in the woman's home, often a small, overcrowded dwelling with a dirt floor, permeable walls, and shared with animals. Imagine the scene: a woman in labor, perhaps lying on a straw-filled pallet or on a few rough blankets on the floor, surrounded by the usual domestic odors of smoke, stale food, and animal waste. The air would be thick with dust and unseen particulate matter. There was no concept of a clean room for delivery. The very surfaces touched during labor, from the hands of the midwife to the ropes or wooden beams used for support, were laden with unseen pathogens. It was an environment perfectly designed for bacteria to flourish and find their way into the most vulnerable parts of a woman's body. Midwives, the primary attendants during childbirth, were often highly experienced and compassionate women, but their practices, by modern standards, were terrifyingly unsterile. They might move directly from tending to a sick family member or even emptying a chamber pot to assisting with a birth without any knowledge of hand washing. Imagine a midwife, her hands rough from years of labor, perhaps stained with grime, reaching inside the birthing canal, unknowingly introducing deadly bacteria. Instruments, if any were used, were rarely, if ever, cleaned beyond a cursory wipe. For instance, a small knife used to cut the umbilical cord might have been used for various household tasks just moments before, its blade carrying countless pathogens. The prevailing belief was that certain rituals or prayers would protect against misfortune, rather than meticulous cleanliness. The risk of puerperal fever, also known as childbed fever, was terrifyingly high. This deadly infection, caused by bacteria entering the birth canal, often through the hands of the attendant, would manifest as a high fever, severe abdominal pain, and often lead to death within days. Imagine the terror of a new mother, having just endured the agony of labor and the joy of holding her newborn, suddenly succumbing to a mysterious, rapid illness, her body racked with pain and fever, unable to nurse her infant. Historical records are replete with instances of women dying in childbirth or shortly thereafter, their deaths often attributed to divine will, a weak constitution, or inexplicable vapors, rather than the microscopic killers thriving in the unsanitary environment. It was a silent epidemic, claiming countless lives, yet its true cause remained a terrifying enigma. The lack of clean water for washing both the mother and the newborn after birth was another dire horror. The birthing process was inherently messy, involving blood, amniotic fluid, and other bodily secretions. Imagine the mother, exhausted and bleeding, lying on soiled linens, with only a small amount of often contaminated water available for a rudimentary cleanup. The newborn, too, would be washed with the same dubious water, often with the same unwashed hands, creating a direct pathway for infection to sensitive skin, eyes, or the umbilical stump, which was a prime entry point for tetanus. The umbilical cord, once cut, was dressed with whatever was at hand, perhaps ash, or a piece of unwashed cloth, further increasing the risk of infection. A red, swollen umbilical stump, a common sight, was a harbinger of potential tragedy for the infant. Disposal of birthing fluids and soiled materials was also managed without any concept of hygiene. After a birth, blood-soaked rags and other waste would likely be simply thrown outside the dwelling, or perhaps buried in a shallow pit nearby, adding to the general filth of the immediate environment and attracting flies and vermin. These contaminated materials continued to pose a risk, releasing pathogens into the air and soil. The mother, bleeding for weeks postpartum, would manage her discharge with reusable rags, washed in often contaminated water, and often not dried properly, creating a constant source of irritation and potential infection for herself. Constant dampness and lack of airflow against her perineum, still healing from birth, created an ideal breeding ground for bacterial and fungal infections. The sheer physical exhaustion, combined with the constant threat of infection, created an immensely perilous postpartum period for women. A woman who had just expended every ounce of her strength in labor was now acutely vulnerable, her body recovering from a profound trauma, her immune system potentially compromised. Without proper nutrition, rest, or any understanding of antiseptic care, she was left to the mercy of microscopic forces. The high rates of maternal and infant mortality in the 13th century are a chilling testament to these horrific sanitary realities. A woman lived with the knowledge that each pregnancy, each birth, was a roll of the dice, a gamble against invisible forces that seemed to defy reason. The joy of a healthy baby was often tempered by the quiet dread of the weeks that followed, praying that both she and her infant would survive the hidden dangers lurking in the very air around them. For the women of 1238, bringing life into the world was an act of profound courage, a defiance of the constant, invisible threats that were inextricably woven into the fabric of their daily existence. Number 2, menstrual hygiene, or lack thereof. For women in 1238, the monthly cycle was not merely a biological reality. It was a profound, deeply personal horror, managed in silence and under a constant shroud of discomfort, shame, and often physical peril. The concept of menstrual hygiene, as we understand it today, discreet, comfortable, and hygienic, was utterly non-existent. Instead, women faced a relentless, isolating struggle to manage a natural bodily function in a world that offered no effective tools, little understanding, and often significant social stigma. Imagine the constant gnawing anxiety that accompanied every movement, every social interaction, every waking moment during those days of the month. Primary horror was the utter lack of suitable materials for absorption. There were no commercially produced pads or tampons. Women had to rely on whatever absorbent materials were at hand, often old rags, pieces of moss, dried leaves, or even straw. Imagine the chafing, the bulkiness, the persistent discomfort of wearing such crude, unhygienic materials against delicate skin. These materials, often reused, were rarely thoroughly cleaned, if cleaned at all, due to the scarcity of clean water and effective cleaning agents. A woman might simply rinse a blood-soaked rag in a communal bucket of water or in a stream, and then let it dry in the open air, where it would pick up dust, dirt, and flies, becoming a breeding ground for bacteria before being used again. This constant exposure to unhygienic materials against the vulva and perineum led to a high incidence of yeast infections, bacterial vaginosis, and other serious infections that would cause constant itching, burning, and discharge, adding to the woman's misery. Disposal methods were another terrifying aspect. Since there were no waste bins or proper sewage systems, soiled materials would often be discarded discreetly in the nearest available location, a shallow pit, a dung heap, or even simply tossed into the street under the cover of darkness. This disposal, while private, contributed to the overall unsanitary environment of the community, attracting flies and other vermin that could then carry pathogens back into homes. The psychological burden of this furtive disposal, the need to hide something so natural, added to the shame and secrecy surrounding menstruation. Constant fear of leakage and visible stains was a profound source of anxiety and embarrassment. Women wore multiple layers of clothing, not just for warmth, but as a desperate attempt to hide any telltale signs of their flow. Imagine the dread of a sudden gush, the quiet panic as a woman felt dampness spreading, wondering if a dark patch was appearing on her outer garments. A visible stain could lead to public humiliation, social ostracization, or even the reinforcement of negative superstitions about menstruating women. Medieval beliefs sometimes attributed ill fortune or impurity to a menstruating woman, further intensifying the need for absolute discretion. This constant vigilance, the need to monitor her body and her clothing, was a relentless drain on a woman's mental and emotional energy. The impact on daily life was immense. For women who worked in fields, markets, or in close proximity to others, managing menstruation was a logistical nightmare. Physical discomfort, the constant worry about leaks, and the sheer effort required to maintain any semblance of modesty meant that some women might have reduced their activity, avoided public spaces, or simply endured their work in misery during their period. Imagine trying to perform strenuous farm labor or haggle in a bustling market while dealing with uncomfortable, soiled rags and the fear of an embarrassing accident. Physical restrictions were palpable, leading to increased fatigue and pain. The social stigma surrounding menstruation was deeply ingrained. In many medieval societies, a menstruating woman was considered ritually unclean, leading to restrictions on her participation in religious ceremonies, cooking certain foods, or even touching certain objects. While these beliefs varied in intensity, the underlying sentiment of impurity was widespread. Imagine the isolating feeling of being deemed unclean for a natural bodily process, the silent judgment that might accompany her during those days. This constant reinforcement of her perceived impurity, coupled with the physical discomfort, could have a profound impact on a woman's self-esteem and her sense of belonging within the community. Furthermore, the lack of understanding about menstruation contributed to various health misconceptions. Irregular cycles, heavy bleeding, or severe pain, dysmenorrhea, were often attributed to imbalances of humors, moral failings, or even demonic influence, rather than gynecological conditions that might have been exacerbated by poor hygiene or malnutrition. There was no concept of hormonal balance or reproductive health in the modern sense. Women suffering from debilitating menstrual pain had little recourse beyond folk remedies or enduring the agony in silence. The psychological toll of chronic pain, combined with the shame and secrecy, was immense, leading to widespread suffering that was often ignored or dismissed. For women in 1238, menstruation was a monthly ordeal, a constant battle against physical discomfort, potential infection, and profound social stigma. It was a secret burden, carried silently, affecting their physical health, their emotional well-being, and their very place within society. The absence of basic hygienic products and knowledge turned a natural biological process into a terrifying, relentless horror that shaped a significant portion of their lives. Number 1. Lack of private toilets and latrines. Imagine for a moment a world where the most private, fundamental human act of relieving oneself was a public spectacle, fraught with danger, indignity, and constant exposure to filth. For women in 1238, this was not a hypothetical scenario. It was the chilling, unavoidable reality of daily life. Pervasive lack of private toilets and proper latrines was perhaps the most fundamental horror of sanitation, impacting women disproportionately, turning every call of nature into an agonizing choice between public humiliation and genuine peril. For the vast majority of people, whether in crowded towns or sparsely populated villages, there were no dedicated, private facilities for bodily waste. The concept of a modern bathroom was centuries away. Most homes, especially those of common folk, lacked any form of internal privy. The only options were either a chamber pot within the dwelling or venturing outside to the nearest available space. Imagine a woman waking in the middle of the night with an urgent need, forced to navigate a dark, potentially dangerous home, or step out into the even more dangerous night, chamber pot in hand. Contents of these pots, once full, would then be summarily emptied into the street, a communal dung heap, or a nearby stream, adding to the general miasma of filth that permeated every public space. This constant open dumping meant that every street corner, every alleyway, every patch of unoccupied ground served as an informal, unsanitary lavatory, its stench a constant reminder of the pervasive lack of hygiene. The lack of personal dignity was a crushing burden. For women who were often subject to stricter social norms and the threat of male predation, finding a private space to relieve themselves was a constant, terrifying challenge. Imagine a woman, perhaps during the day, needing to urinate or defecate with no private spot in sight. She would have to seek out a secluded wall, a hidden bush, or an unobserved corner, always acutely aware of the possibility of being seen, of being judged, or worse, of being accosted. This exposure was not just embarrassing, it carried genuine risks, particularly for younger women or those traveling alone. Accounts from medieval chronicles occasionally allude to attacks or assaults linked to women seeking isolated spots for their needs, painting a grim picture of the vulnerability inherent in such simple acts. The anxiety of being exposed, of feeling utterly undignified, was a constant, gnawing presence. The specific physiological needs of women exacerbated this horror. Pregnancy often brings increased frequency of urination, particularly in the later stages. Imagine a pregnant woman, already uncomfortable and fatigued, needing to relieve herself almost constantly, with no easy or dignified way to do so. Effort and discomfort involved in finding a secluded spot, especially in inclement weather, would be immense. Similarly, during menstruation, the need to attend to hygiene was constant, yet the very act of managing it in public or semi-public spaces was almost impossible. A woman might endure hours of discomfort, delaying a trip to the fields or market, simply because of the sheer impossibility of finding a private place to manage her flow. For the very wealthy, some castles or grand houses featured guardrobes, small rooms with a hole in the floor, or a stone seat that emptied directly into a cesspit or moat below. While offering a degree of privacy, these were still crude, often cold, and their stench was ever present, emanating from the pit below. Even these luxuries were far from hygienic, acting as breeding grounds for flies and releasing foul odors into the surrounding areas. The vast majority of women, however, lived in conditions where such rudimentary private facilities were unimaginable. Consequences of this pervasive lack of private and sanitary facilities were dire. Indiscriminate dumping of human waste directly contributed to the spread of waterborne diseases like dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Rain would wash the fecal matter into rivers and streams, contaminating the very water sources from which communities drew their drinking water. Imagine a woman fetching water from a communal well, unknowingly drawing up water contaminated by the waste of her neighbors, or even her own family, which had seeped into the groundwater. Constant proximity to human excrement also attracted rats and flies, notorious carriers of fleas and bacteria, bringing diseases directly into homes and onto food. Children playing in the dirt streets would be constantly exposed to pathogens, leading to high rates of parasitic infections and gastrointestinal illnesses. The very air of towns and villages was often thick with the stench of human waste, a constant, sickening reminder of the unsanitary conditions. This wasn't merely an unpleasant smell, it signaled the invisible presence of deadly pathogens. Women spending their lives within these environments, cooking, cleaning, and caring for the sick, were constantly exposed to these hazards. The mental and physical toll of this constant exposure, the pervasive odor, and the gnawing anxiety of managing personal needs in such a public, dangerous, and unsanitary way was immeasurable. For a woman in 1238, the lack of private toilets and latrines was a pervasive, inescapable horror that stripped away dignity, threatened personal safety, and acted as a relentless engine of disease. It was a daily affront to her senses and her well-being, an utterly dehumanizing aspect of life in a world utterly devoid of what we now consider the most basic human right, the right to private, sanitary waste disposal.